Anybody working in business in the UK in the last couple of years has probably seen the four letters GDPR. And very simply, we're talking about General Data Protection Regulations. This is a European-wide piece of guidance, soon to be legislation, that will make sure that what used to be the Data Protection Act is brought up to date. The Data Protection Act is 20 years old, and therefore, if you think about how we did business then, it's a very different world. So how we deal with things like IP addresses, etc., has to be factored in. Now, obviously, some of the people at Rothmans watching this, accountants, will be dealing with this as far as their own firm is concerned. But everybody has to look at this for their business, because I'm joined by Jonathan, rather than Tim today, we're joined by Jonathan Clark, who is a management consultant with expert knowledge in this field, and therefore hopefully going to be able to point us in the right direction. Every business needs to look at this. It doesn't matter if you are a firm of accountants, whether you're a management consultancy business, whether you're a clothes shop. Everybody has to think about how they are going to deal with this. And what would you say the fundamental changes between the old data protection rules and where we are with GDPR?
So you're right. I mean, as of May this year, every business in the UK, every business in Europe responsible in any way for having customer data will be impacted by GDPR. The fundamental change is we're moving from a reactive environment under the DPA 98 to a really proactive environment under GDPR. So now you're not just worried about a breach. The ICO in Europe will come and look at whether or not you're prepared to avoid breaches in the first place. Okay,
so previously if I'd have got a little memory stick with loads of client data on it, I've left that on a train somewhere. Historically, I'd have been in trouble for leaving it on a train. Now I'll be in trouble for not having put in place plans and procedures to make sure I didn't leave it on the train in the first place.
That's exactly right. So you need to have an appropriate control regime in your organisation which prevents those kind of breaches ever happening in the first place. And they can even audit you to see if those controls are in place prior to any potential breach.
Okay, so it's not even that the people, the ICO, the organisation responsible for looking after this, it's not that the ICO will turn up once something has happened. They could turn up at any moment and say, we'd like to see all of your procedures, please, to prove that you've thought this through.
Absolutely. You need to be compliant and prove that, again, you have an appropriate control regime. And if there's a risk of a breach, under the DPA, you have to report a breach. Under GDPR, you have to report to the ICO within 72 hours if there's a risk of a breach. Very different control methodology entirely.
Okay, and then there's all sorts of things relating to, one of the most common situations is with marketing. I know I have to put a little tick box on every email I send out saying if you'd like to unsubscribe, that's okay. I can't even just leave it that way around anymore, can I?
No, it's now about positive opt-in. Any service that a customer signs up to with an organisation now needs to have positive opt-in for use of prescribed control data.
Okay, and then to extend that even further so people appreciate what they've got to do, it's not even that I can then just say, okay, you're happy for me to have all your data, thanks. I have to explain to them what I'm going to use it for, and that could be a number of different things.
Completely. So you can't have bundled services with the same positive opt-in. The ICO are very clear that if you have entirely disparate services, audit, accounting, consulting, these services are different enough to warrant their own positive opt-in for service from a customer for use of data specific to that service.
And one of the big myths around is that small businesses don't have to do anything in this. Simply not true.
Myth number one, all business involved in the use of customer data will be impacted by GDPR to a greater or lesser degree, but all are impacted. It's a myth that small business gets out of it.
So let's give our viewers a 4-point plan of things they need to do. First of all, they need to put somebody in charge.
Yeah, and whether or not it's a data protection officer, so very large organisations operating at scale or public authorities will require a data protection officer. That's number one. You then need to map your data. Understand where your data resides. Take time to carefully understand, if you're a large organisation, what your data architecture is.
And that could be in a filing cabinet, that could be on a CRM software, it could be in all sorts of different places. It could be in the MD's phone.
It could be in the MD's phone, it could be in the cloud, it could be across multiple geographies. It could exist within third parties and outsourcers.
Okay.
It's your responsibility, your accountability as a data controller to understand where that data resides.
Okay.
Then you need to make sure that the appropriate cybercrime and cyber security controls and information security regime exists across the whole organisation to be able to adequately protect data protection inside your organisation.
And that could be something as simple as making sure your virus software is up to date, understanding that certain emails probably shouldn't be opened, all the way through to, you know, do we have a safe where we keep the backup, it could be all of those things.
Two-factor authentication, is your firewall turned on? All of the above, but an appropriate data control regime.
Okay.
And the last thing really, and it's kind of all-encompassing because all the same rules apply, is third-party contracts. Have a very, very careful look at all of your outsourced contracts, whether it's outsourced or just supply contracts, but all the same rules apply as if they were part of your own operation. And be very, very careful because you're a data controller as an organisation. You need to be aware there needs to be a written contract with the data processor, whether that processor is inside the organisation or external, but it's the same regime applies.
But to give a very simple example of how wide this could be, you go to a dress shop who are going to make a dress for you. That is then the dress shop takes the measurements, puts a bit of paper with your name, your address, and your various measurements, and sends it off to somebody else who's actually going to cut the fabric on their behalf. Then in that situation, you actually have given personal data to somebody else. You would need to make sure that you are happy with every part of that chain.
Yeah, you're responsible for the anonymity of that data if it's required. If you're sending out data with a name, address, date of birth and measurements, that's personal data. And the customer is allowed to extract that data from your process and say, no, thank you very much. The ICO have gone to fairly extreme examples of the kinds of data that can be included here, which includes your biometric or your genome data. So it's pretty all-encompassing.
It is rather more than the old name and address that used to be in the Data Protection Act. A hugely important document, and 4 letters which I think you will appreciate after watching this, you cannot afford to ignore. Whatever size of business you are in, whatever industry you're in, you have to consider whether this applies to you, how it impacts on you. Make sure you have decided who's going to be in charge, and if you do need further advice, the guys at Rothmans will be able to point you in the right direction.